Picture this. You're a coiled spring made of iron and flesh. For 4 straight hours, you've been nothing but a moving target. 30,000 screaming enemies swarm around you like a storm that never breaks, burying your shield in arrows, slashing at your legs, aiming for the eyes of your horse. You're bleeding. Your brothers are dying beside you. Every instinct in your body is screaming to break rank, to turn, to kill. But you don't, because you've been frozen by a single command from the most terrifying king in Christendom. And then, the tension finally snaps. 2 knights break formation. The roar of St. George rips through the air like thunder. In the span of a heartbeat, you go from a statue to a missile. 4,000 tons of armored cavalry slam into the enemy line. And what happens next isn't a battle. It's an erasure. In just 17 minutes of pure, unfiltered violence, an army that seemed invincible is shattered like glass. This is the Battle of Arsuf, the day discipline defeated numbers, and the day Richard the Lionheart proved that patience isn't passive. Patience is deadly. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more long-form storytelling like this. And comment below. Let me know where you're listening from. It still blows my mind that we're exploring these ancient events together, from completely different parts of the world, connected across time by the same curiosity. Now, to understand the shock of those 17 minutes, we need to strip away the myth. This wasn't a duel between noble knights. This was a collision between 2 completely different military worlds, 2 systems that were built to destroy each other. On the march to Arsuf, Richard the Lionheart had turned his army into something terrifying, a machine, not a crusading mob, not a band of warriors chasing glory, a machine. He created a moving fortress, a column of heavy infantry forming a protective shell on the outside, shielding the most precious weapon inside, the heavy cavalry. It was a formation designed to do one thing: absorb punishment until the enemy got too close. And Saladin, the master of the East, took the bait. He hurled his entire army at this marching column, convinced he could crack the shell before the hammer fell. He was wrong. Because the road to Arsuf wasn't a march. It was a hallway of death. The Crusader column stretched for miles, trapped between the sea on one side and a forest packed with 30,000 killers on the other. Saladin's strategy was brutal in its simplicity. The swarm. He unleashed waves of mounted archers, Bedouin skirmishers, Nubian infantry, fighters built for speed, harassment, and exhaustion. And they didn't just attack. They clung to the Crusader column like bees on a wounded animal. They rode within yards of the Christian line, firing arrows point-blank into mail and leather. The sound never stopped. Drums, cymbals, war horns, and the constant clatter of arrows slamming into shields. It wasn't just warfare. It was psychological torture. A siege on the mind before the siege on the body. But Richard's discipline was almost inhuman. He rode the line constantly, a giant of a man shouting commands, ordering his soldiers to hold, to wait, to keep marching. Because he understood exactly what Saladin wanted. Saladin wanted them to charge early. If the Crusaders broke formation too soon, they'd scatter across the plain, lose cohesion, and get picked apart one by one in the desert. So Richard refused. They just kept walking. They walked through the arrow storm. Men marched with arrows sticking out of their armor like porcupines. They ignored the pain, ignored the insults shouted in their faces. ignored the temptation to chase. They became a walking anvil, waiting for the hammer. And by the time the army reached the gardens of Arsuf, the pressure reached a breaking point. The enemy wasn't just shooting anymore. Now they were charging into the line with maces and swords, slamming into the rear guard, trying to provoke the Crusaders into a desperate fight. And it was the Hospitallers at the rear who took the brunt of it. They were walking backward, fighting off constant attacks, watching their horses collapse under arrows and exhaustion, and they sent message after message to Richard. "Sire, we cannot hold. We must charge." Richard's answer never changed. Wait. He wasn't being stubborn. He was waiting for synchronization, the perfect moment when Saladin's entire army would be committed, pulled in close by blood and confidence. So close they couldn't escape the counterpunch. This is what makes Arsuf so fascinating. It wasn't won by some clever flank maneuver. It wasn't won by surprise. It was won by timing. It was a high-stakes game of chicken. Richard was betting his men could endure hell for just a little longer. Saladin was betting that human nature would force them to break. And in a way, Saladin was right. The discipline did break, but it broke at the exact moment Richard needed it to. Because when the charge finally happened, it wasn't chaos. It was weeks of suppressed rage turning into kinetic force. Imagine the physics of that impact. Thousands of knights, frustrated, angry, terrified, suddenly unleashed. Heavy war horses going from a standstill to a gallop in seconds. And the Saracen light cavalry, the same fighters who were used to dancing out of danger, suddenly staring at a wall of steel moving at 20 miles per hour. There was no time to turn, no time to scatter, no time to run. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Dust exploded into the sky so thick that men fought by sound and instinct. And when the dust settled, the result was unmistakable. Saladin's army, this invincible, terrifying force, had been trampled into the dirt. Arsuf teaches a brutal lesson about war. The difference between a skirmish and a massacre is sometimes just minutes. For weeks, Saladin had been the hunter. In 17 minutes, he became the prey. Richard didn't just defeat the enemy, he broke their spirit. He proved that the Franks weren't mindless brutes. They were disciplined soldiers capable of executing a plan under extreme duress. And as we dissect this battle, we're going to see exactly how Richard engineered this slaughter, step by bloody step. Because at Arsuf, a formation of men walking along a beach became the deadliest weapon of the Middle Ages. To truly grasp the magnitude of Arsuf, you have to understand something. This wasn't just a battle over land. It was a collision between two opposing physics engines. In the red corner, you had Richard I of England. Forget the fairy tales. In Third Crusade history, Richard wasn't some shining hero chasing glory. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a man who treated war like an engineering problem. He understood that the desert killed more men than swords ever could. So he rewrote the rules of European warfare. His masterstroke? He glued his army to the Mediterranean coast. This was the core of Richard the Lionheart's tactics. By keeping the sea on his right, his fleet could sail alongside him, feeding the army like a conveyor belt. Food, water, fresh ammunition, no long supply lines to cut, no starving, no thirst. He turned his army into a self-sustaining machine, a land battleship, a fortress that couldn't be strangled. And on the landward flank, on the left, he placed heavy infantry, a human shield wall, protecting the cavalry horses inside. Defensive, slow, brilliant. Now in the blue corner sat Saladin, and he was the mirror opposite. Where Richard was solid, Saladin was fluid. His power came from speed, deception, and the terrifying mobility of Turkish horse archers. Saladin's strategy had always been attrition, luring heavy European knights into the deep desert, cutting them off from water, watching them collapse from heat stroke before closing in for the kill. That's exactly how he annihilated the Kingdom of Jerusalem at Hattin 4 years earlier. But at Arsuf, Saladin was panicking because Richard refused to play the game. Richard wouldn't be lured inland. He just kept marching south, day after day, devouring miles toward the port of Jaffa. And if Richard took Jaffa, the road to Jerusalem opened wide. Saladin's hit-and-run tactics were bouncing off Richard's discipline like pebbles off a tank. So Saladin made the decision he didn't want to make. He needed to smash the tank. He needed a full-scale engagement. And the geography forced his hand. Near the forest of Arsuf, the coastal plain narrows. Dense woods press right up to the sea, creating a natural choke point. Saladin looked at that bottleneck and saw opportunity. He could hide his massive army, 30,000 strong, in the tree line, just a few hundred yards from where Richard's column had to pass. It was a classic nightmare. Saladin would mask his numbers with the forest, swarm out at point-blank range, neutralize the Crusader crossbows, hammer the rear of the column, and try to tear the tail away from the head. Divide and conquer, at an enormous scale. For the soldiers on the ground, the tension was unbearable. Richard's men knew they were walking into an ambush. They could smell enemy campfires. They could hear the drums in the woods, constant, unsettling, designed to disorient and terrify. And yet, they kept walking. Not blind obedience, calculated trust. They believed Richard was the best soldier alive. They believed he had a plan. But they also knew that one wrong move, one gap in the shield wall, and Saladin's army would pour in and drown them all. The board was set. Richard was the immovable object. Saladin was the irresistible force. And at Arsuf, something had to break. The formation Richard deployed on the morning of September 7th wasn't just a tactic. It was human engineering on the edge of collapse. In Third Crusade history, armies were usually messy, half-organized mobs held together by adrenaline and prayer. But Richard built something else, a machine. He divided his force into 12 squadrons, arranged in strict hierarchy. At the very front, the vanguard, he placed the Knights Templar. These weren't just soldiers, they were fanatics, the shock troops of Christendom, men who had sworn they would never retreat. In the center marched the heavy cavalry of the Poitevins, Bretons, and Angevins, protecting the king himself, and at the rear, the place of maximum danger, he placed the Knights Hospitaller. But Richard's brilliance wasn't just in the order of the cavalry. It was in the shield that wrapped around them. Because Richard knew something every commander feared. Medieval heavy cavalry had an Achilles heel: their horses. A knight on foot is a tank. A knight on a dead horse is just a slow man inside a metal coffin. So Richard wrapped his cavalry in a thick blanket of infantry. On the left flank, facing the desert, marched a solid wall of foot soldiers. The front rank knelt with spears planted into the ground like roots, creating a hedgehog of steel designed to stop any charge. The second rank stood behind them with crossbows, ready to answer every arrow with a bolt. This was the moving fortress. Inside the shell, the knights rode in relative safety, matching the slow, grinding pace of the walking men. But Richard went even further. He understood fatigue. Marching in chainmail under Middle Eastern sun isn't just exhausting, It's like being baked alive inside an oven. So to prevent heat stroke from breaking his wall, Richard created a rotation system. The infantry was divided into two halves. One half marched on the outer edge, blocking arrows, taking hits, fighting skirmishers. The other half marched closer to the sea, carrying baggage, recovering in the shade of the cavalry. Every few hours, they swapped positions, and that simple logistical trick meant something terrifying to Saladin. Richard's army didn't stop. They didn't unravel. They didn't panic. They just kept moving like a machine that refused to die. As they passed the gardens of Arsuf, the harassment started in earnest. Saladin shifted from observation to provocation. Bedouin skirmishers raced up to the Crusader line, howling insults, flinging javelins, even exposing their backsides, mocking the Christians, begging them to break formation and chase. It was a seductive trap. Because for a medieval knight, honor was everything. To be insulted by an infidel and not respond felt like poison in the soul. But Richard's orders were ironclad. No one charges until the trumpet sounds. And the discipline was suffocating. Imagine being a crossbowman on the outer edge. You're marching backward half the time. You load your weapon, slow, mechanical, winding the crank while arrows zip past your ears. You fire, drop a target, and before you can even breathe, 3 more enemies take his place. Your mouth is dry, your eyes burn with sweat, and the only thing keeping you alive is the shield of the man beside you. If he breaks, you die. If you break, the horses die. And if the horses die, the crusade ends. This was the march of death. A pressure cooker designed to see who cracked first. Richard was banking on professionalism and fanaticism. Saladin was banking on heat and human impulse. And as the woods of Arsuf thickened on the left, the Saracen attacks grew bolder. They weren't just skirmishing anymore. They were testing the structure. They were searching for a loose brick in Richard's wall. And as the army entered the narrowest part of the plain, Saladin decided it was time to drop the hammer. At mid-morning, the forest erupted. This wasn't a wave, it was a flood. 30,000 men spilled out of the trees, a terrifying mix of Bedouin lancers, Nubian infantry with red headbands and iron clubs, and deadly Turkish mounted archers. But the first thing that hit the Crusaders wasn't steel, it was sound. Saladin was a master of psychological warfare. He knew fear paralyzed faster than wounds. So he ordered his musicians to play continuously. Thousands of cymbals crashed. Drums thundered like a heartbeat gone wrong. Brass trumpets screamed over the field. Chroniclers wrote the noise was so loud you couldn't have heard God's thunder. That was the point. The sound was designed to drown out Richard's commands, to isolate every soldier in confusion, to make them feel alone, surrounded, hopeless. Then came the arrows, and they didn't aim for precision. They aimed for volume. Saracen composite bows, made of horn and sinew, could fire rapidly from horseback. Mounted archers galloped to within 50 yards, point-blank range, released a shaft, and wheeled away before a crossbow bolt could catch them. The sky darkened, not metaphorically. The density of arrows actually cast a shadow over the column. But Saladin wasn't really targeting the men. He knew knights in mail couldn't be easily penetrated. He was targeting the horses. Because the destrier, the heavy war horse, was the engine of Crusader power. Without it, a knight was just a walking statue. So Saladin's archers focused their fire on the legs and bellies of the Hospitaller horses at the rear. The beasts screamed, maddened with pain. They reared, kicked, collapsed, throwing riders into the dust. The rear guard was becoming unbearable. The Hospitallers were essentially walking backward into a buzzsaw. They had to step over dead mounts, shield their faces from arrows, and fight off Sudanese infantry rushing in to hamstring the remaining horses with hooks and maces. This was the swarm in its purest form. Saladin was throwing bodies into the line, accepting casualties to pin the Crusaders down. He rode among his men, urging them closer. "Engage them!" he shouted. "Bring them down!" He was running out of time, because despite everything, the column kept moving. The moving fortress was battered, bleeding, bristling with arrows like a giant porcupine, but it was still moving. So Saladin concentrated everything on the tail. He tried to crush the Hospitallers by sheer weight of numbers. The distance between the two armies shrank until it vanished. This was no longer missile warfare. It became a brawl. And in that brawl, the legendary discipline of the Knights Hospitaller began to fray. To understand the explosion that was about to happen, we have to zoom in on one man, Garnier de Nablus, Grand Master of the Hospitallers, the commander of the rearguard, the section Saladin had chosen to annihilate. By noon, Garnier's situation had moved beyond difficult and into the realm of suicidal, because rearguard warfare is the most psychologically draining position imaginable. You're walking away from the enemy, turning your back on them, and every instinct inside you says that's wrong. The Hospitallers were being pelted so heavily that chroniclers wrote the ground looked like a field of wheat, except the stalks were arrow shafts, and the Saracens, seeing the Christians still refusing to charge, grew bolder. They closed in. They struck the knights' armor with maces and swords, and they shouted insults meant to cut deeper than steel. "You are women! You are not men!" Garnier was a veteran. He understood discipline, but he was watching his order get dismantled piece by piece. The horses were dying at a catastrophic rate, and in the world of heavy cavalry, losing your horse wasn't just losing mobility. It was losing honor, losing power, losing safety, and the shame of walking while the enemy laughed at you burned hotter than the sun. So Garnier rode forward to find Richard. He found the king in the center of the column, calm and watchful, eyes on the tree line. Garnier pleaded, "Sire, we are being pressed too hard. We are losing our horses. We cannot hold much longer. Let us charge." Richard looked at him, and he saw the desperation. But he looked past Garnier and toward the enemy. Saladin's army was still loose, still fluid. If the Crusaders turned now, the Saracens would scatter like smoke. Richard needed them close. He needed them committed. He needed them trapped. So he gave the most infuriating command imaginable. "Patience, master. You must endure. Good things come to those who wait." Garnier rode back, furious. He ordered his men to hold, and the march continued. The attacks intensified. A second time, Garnier broke protocol and sent another messenger. "Sire, we are being slaughtered like cattle. We will be shamed forever if we do not fight back." Again. The reply came, "Wait." This was the ultimate test. Richard was asking his men to commit suicide by inaction. He was gambling that the spring of their rage wouldn't snap before he released the latch. But the physics of the battlefield were shifting. Saladin could smell blood. He committed his reserves. The swarm grew so dense the Saracens were practically touching the tails of Crusader horses. The gap between armies vanished. Back in the rear guard, the atmosphere was electric. Knights were shaking, not from fear, but from suppressed violence. Their hands gripped lances so tightly their knuckles turned white. They muttered prayers that sounded more like curses, and the pressure reached the critical point. Garnier looked at his men, then at the enemy just yards away, and he realized the truth. If they didn't charge now, they wouldn't survive long enough to charge at all. The chain of command was about to be broken by the chain of survival. Richard up front likely sensed it too. He wanted the perfect moment, when the whole army could turn as one, presenting a solid steel wall. But history doesn't always wait for perfect timing. Sometimes, history is made because one man, in one moment, decides he has had enough, and the breaking point arrived, not with a trumpet blast, but with the frustration of two men, the marshal of the Hospitallers and a knight named Baldwin de Caron. They watched their horses bleed out. They were mocked to their faces, and the instinct to kill overwhelmed obedience. Without orders, without a plan. They wheeled their horses around. They forced their way through gaps in their own infantry line. And as they cleared the shield wall, they screamed the cry that would echo for centuries. St. George. That was the spark. The powder keg exploded. Instantly, the entire Hospitaller squadron followed. No hesitation, no second guessing. Their brothers were charging, so the rear guard unleashed its rage. Then the French squadrons next to them turned, then the Flemish, and the reaction rippled up the line faster than thought itself. The moving fortress was dismantling and transforming into a tidal wave. Up at the center, Richard heard the roar before he saw movement. For a split second, this was disaster. The charge was premature. The Knights Templar at the front hadn't even begun. The army was attacking in pieces, exactly what Saladin wanted. If Richard hesitated, the Hospitallers would be isolated and slaughtered. The Crusade would collapse into chaos. But this is where Richard earned his legend. He didn't fight the tide, he rode it. He shouted for his trumpeters to sound the general attack. The signal blasted out, confirming what the men were already doing. This wasn't insubordination anymore. This was total war, and the transformation was horrifying to behold. One moment, the Crusaders were a sluggish column of dusty, passive targets. The next, the infantry ranks split open like curtains, and through those gaps poured thousands of armored knights, lowering 12-foot lances, locking shields, accelerating into history. For the Saracens, the world flipped upside down. They had been crowding the Christians, poking at them, convinced they were exhausted and afraid. They were practically standing on top of the Crusader line. So when the charge began, they had zero reaction time. Their horses were standing still, or moving slow. And you cannot accelerate a light horse fast enough to escape a heavy charger that's already at full gallop. The air filled with the thunder of hooves. Dust erupted so thick it blotted out the sun. But through that dust, the Saracens saw the one thing they feared most: the wall of steel, Templars at the front, Poitevins in the center, Hospitallers at the rear, and they hit the enemy line almost simultaneously. The march discipline had transformed into charge discipline, and the trap Saladin thought he was setting had just snapped shut on his own neck. The collision of the Crusader army with Saladin's line wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a physics equation finally resolving itself in the most brutal way possible. To understand those 17 minutes, you have to understand the sheer kinetic energy that got unleashed. A fully armored knight on a destrier could weigh nearly 1,500 pounds. Now picture that mass moving at a gallop, 25 miles per hour. That isn't a soldier. That's a projectile. Now multiply it by 4,000. When that wall of steel hit Saladin's stationary, lightly armored troops, the result was catastrophic. Modern biomechanics experts estimate the force of a lance impact at that speed is like being struck by a small truck. The front ranks of Saladin's army didn't just die, they were erased. Chroniclers describe a sound louder than the drums, the sickening crunch of wood splintering and bone collapsing. Eastern warfare relied on space, on flow, on the ability to absorb shock and scatter. But Saladin had crowded his men too close to the Crusaders. There was no space left. His archers, seconds ago the hunters, were suddenly trapped. They were trampled under iron-shod hooves before they could even reach for a sword. Dust became the third player on the battlefield. The charge kicked up a cloud so dense that visibility dropped to nearly zero. Men fought by sound and silhouette. But in that blindness, the Crusaders had the advantage. They didn't need to aim. They just needed to ride forward. The wall of steel worked like a snowplow, pushing enemy bodies backward, crushing everything in its path. And this is where the 17 minutes really comes into focus. It didn't take hours for Saladin's army to collapse. The structure broke almost instantly after impact. The Bedouins and Turkish archers realized they were defenseless against this armor. They panicked, and panic spreads faster than any order. The flow Saladin relied on turned into a stampede. In those moments, Richard the Lionheart was in his element. He wasn't commanding from the rear. He was in the front rank. Accounts from both sides describe him like a demon wearing a crown. He wielded a heavy battle axe, carving a path through the Saracens with such ferocity that his skin was rubbed raw inside his armor. He was the tip of the spear, driving the charge deep toward the forest. In less time than it takes to watch a sitcom episode, the field of Arsuf transformed. That screaming horde of 30,000 men became scattered clusters of fugitives sprinting for their lives. The Crusader charge had punched straight through the center of Saladin's formation. The invincible army of the East hadn't just been beaten, it had been run over. But if the charge was the equation, the aftermath was the horror story. In medieval warfare, most casualties don't happen during the fight. They happen during the rout. As Saladin's line disintegrated, the Crusaders turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. Weeks of pent-up rage poured out of them like poison. The knights hunted down fleeing infantry. The porcupines finally got their revenge. And this is where Richard separates himself from almost every other commander of his age. Most armies, once unleashed, become an uncontrollable mob. They chase too far. They scatter. They loot. They lose formation. And then they get ambushed. Richard knew that. He knew Saladin still had reserves hidden in the woods. He knew that if his knights scattered into chaos, a victory could turn into a disaster in seconds. So right in the middle of adrenaline, blood, and screaming, Richard did the impossible. He hit the brakes. He rode into the mess, voice booming over the chaos, ordering his men to halt. He forced the Knights Templar and Hospitallers to stop, to turn, to reform. Imagine what that takes. Stopping a charging warhorse, stopping a blood-crazed knight in the middle of a massacre. But they obeyed. The Crusader line reformed just in time. Because Saladin, desperate to save his army, had rallied his personal guard and launched a counterattack. He expected to find scattered pursuers. Instead, he slammed face first into a reformed wall of Crusader steel. Richard led a second charge, then a third. He treated the battle like controlled demolition. Charge, destroy, halt, reform, charge, destroy, halt, reform. It terrified the Muslim chroniclers. Baha ad-Din, Saladin's biographer, described Richard as unparalleled, moving across the battlefield like a force of nature, his axe clearing a path wherever he rode. By evening, the 17-minute explosion settled into grim reality. The field of Arsuf was carpeted with bodies. 32 of Saladin's top emirs were dead. The myth of the Saracen swarm, the belief they could harass the Franks with impunity, was shattered. Richard hadn't just defeated Saladin. He humiliated him. He proved something terrifying. He could turn the fury of the Franks on and off like a switch. The pursuit was short, brutal, and disciplined. And for the survivors staggering back to camp, the message was clear. The lion was not to be tested. Back in the Saracen camp, the mood was funereal. For decades, Saladin had cultivated an image of divine favor, protector of Islam, the man who reclaimed Jerusalem. But as the sun set on September 7th, that image lay shattered in the dust of Arsuf. This defeat wasn't just about body count. Though thousands of his best men were gone, it was about psychological trauma. Baha ad-Din records Saladin sitting in his tent refusing to eat, tears streaming down his face. His emirs, proud commanders of cavalry, came to him in shame. And when Saladin demanded to know how a smaller army had crushed them, their answer was telling. They didn't blame terrain. They didn't blame weather. They spoke of the iron wall. They told him the Frankish knights weren't men. They were walls of iron that could not be broken. They described arrows striking the Crusaders and falling away like water off stone. That moment matters in Third Crusade history, because it marks when the Muslim world realized something uncomfortable. You could not stop European heavy cavalry in a head-on collision. The armor gap was too great. Bravery alone wouldn't bridge it. The strategic consequences were immediate. Saladin knew if he fought Richard in the open again, he risked losing his entire empire. So he abandoned the coast. He ordered the fortifications at Ascalon dismantled, scorched earth policy, not out of strategy, out of fear. For Richard, Arsuf validated his ruthless discipline. He proved that if a Western army was controlled properly, it could walk through fire and survive. But for Saladin, Arsuf was a wake-up call. The Lionheart wasn't just another barbarian king. He was a lethal intellect wrapped in steel. The war continued, but the dynamic shifted forever. Saladin would never again dare meet Richard in open field. The lion had roared, and the fox had learned to run. In the end, the Battle of Arsuf wasn't decided by sharper swords or faster horses. It was decided by who could hold their breath the longest. For hours, Richard forced his men to deny every basic instinct. The instinct to run. The instinct to fight back. The instinct to survive individually. He bound them into a machine that functioned on one brain, his. And those 17 minutes are a brutal reminder that in war, and maybe even in life, timing is everything. Saladin was a genius, but at Arsuf, he was impatient. He mistook caution for fear. He mistook a moving fortress for a slow target, and he paid for it with the flower of his army. Richard never did retake Jerusalem. Politics and illness would eventually force him home. But Arsuf saved the Third Crusade from total disaster. It bought the Christian kingdom another 100 years of life in the Holy Land, and it sealed a legacy that lasted centuries. Numbers mean nothing without discipline. An army of lions led by a sheep will lose to an army of sheep led by a lion. But at Arsuf, the Crusaders had something even worse for their enemies, an army of lions, led by a lion. So the next time you hear the name Richard the Lionheart, don't just picture some brave knight chasing glory. Picture the man who walked through hell for hours, listening to the screams of dying horses, holding back the tide of rage until the clock struck the perfect second. Picture the discipline behind the fury, because that is the true face of victory. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychology and physics of medieval warfare, smash that subscribe button like the Templars smashed the Saracen line. Leave a comment below. Do you think Richard should have marched straight to Jerusalem after this victory, or was he right to stay cautious? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your take. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part of history.